Alrighty. Hello, Natalia. Welcome to ESL Talk.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm very excited to speak to you guys.
We are too, because you have a really interesting topic about
Hmm.
speaking English with confidence. Because I know for me as a native speaker and for Faye, who's lived in Canada and has spoken English pretty much your whole life, right?
Yeah.
It can be a struggle and we can lack
Hmm.
confidence sometimes. So could you
Hmm.
share your journey, Natalia, in helping Spanish speakers become more confident and what inspired you to start on this path?
Sure. Well, it all started when I was in university, and I had a friend that he was really shy with like speaking English. He just felt very scared. And because I grew up, well, I was raised with my Canadian dad.
Mm.
I spoke English all my life with him and with my mom Spanish, right? So I had like background that was multicultural because my family is from Italy and Canada and Costa Rica, right?
Mhm.
So
Wow.
I'm really into languages. And I would tell him, no, practice with me. And he was like, no, I'm so shy. I'm so shy. And I'm like, um, don't worry about your mistakes. No, like I'll give you feedback. And little by little, he started like speaking to me in English, like during break times, and all of that. And so I could feel that he started to open up more about the struggle of speaking English with confidence. And that's where I started to see that need.
Awesome.
Mm. Interesting. Now, having that background of both languages, so you kind of get the best of both worlds. What do you think are the most common challenges that Spanish speakers specifically have when learning English, and how do you address those specific challenges in your teaching?
Sure. Well, most of it is like the mindset that there is because there's this idea of like English is really hard. Also, this idea that maybe some people can speak it, but I can't because I
Mm.
didn't have like the resources when I was younger. And so they have this idea that it's too late now that they're older,
Mm.
right? Also, pronunciation, just feeling like afraid of expressing themselves and that they're not that like they don't like to have an accent or they feel uncomfortable with their accent, right?
Yeah, this doesn't
Definitely.
even seem exclusive to any group, right? Of learners. Like
Yeah.
it's so common for adult learners to have those filters, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And with Spanish speakers as well, there's certain sounds in English that are very hard, like there's some harder sounds like H sounds and J sounds and TH sounds that
Hmm.
can be very, very difficult. So I think it's right what you say, Natalia. Sometimes they hear themselves or other people, maybe English speakers kind of, what did you say? Sorry. And then they lose confidence, right? So
Hmm.
it's really, really yeah, it's really understandable. So in talking about confidence, what are your top strategies for building confidence in your students?
Well, first of all, it's a change in the mindset. Like it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay that we're learning and it's going to take time. It's not automatic. Also, this thing of many of them want to achieve a level of proficiency that is really high in the beginning. Like they want to express themselves in the same way that they express themselves in their native language, right? And so that's not possible, and they get frustrated. They say, oh, my English is bad. And I say, okay, no, no, we don't have to express ourselves in the same way as in Spanish. We're going to go little by little. So it's like starting to build up with simplicity first and getting rid of all the complexity of structures that are too advanced and frustrating and starting to develop that. Also, another thing that I do is I work in the natural, like a natural method and just in general, like different methods that help them in according to their level, right? Like listening, this thing of immersing themselves in the language instead of forcing them to speak right away. Like, no, we're gonna listen. We're gonna also be reading, and we're gonna try our best to just say simple things.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's just keeping it manageable for them, right? Those grand objectives. We've talked about this before. Like, I want to be a fluent speaker. Well, what does that mean? And what are the steps to get there? But
Yes.
you mentioned also the idea of like when they make mistakes and they're like, oh, but I can't speak it that way. The pressure that students put on themselves is so high. And speaking of mistakes, this can be a bit of a taboo, right? In language learning. Students always say, I make too many mistakes. I don't want to make a mistake, or I made a mistake. How do you encourage your students then to embrace these mistakes? Like you said, you tell them it's okay, and little by little, How can you encourage them to do that as part of the learning process?
Yeah, well, I have this phrase that is, love is the opposite of fear. So when I teach them about topics that encourage them emotionally, that I can connect with them, and it's a lot deeper than just grammar and, like, let's study this lesson in a dry way, but we're like actually learning interesting topics where I'm connecting with them emotionally too as human beings. Then they start to receive this like nurturing process instead of feeling like they're bombarded by grammar, exams, and pressure,
Yes.
because the like anxiety cannot happen when somebody's acquiring a language. And because in the like, let's say, traditional educational system, we see a lot of that. We see a lot of stress, a lot of evaluation.
Yeah.
And so we think that, oh, that's what we should do with our students because that's the pressure they need. But when a person is learning another language, a new language, they shouldn't feel anxious. They shouldn't feel this pressure. So
Yes.
what I feel in is that idea of nurturing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
so
about
true.
creating a safe space, and if students feel like they're safe, they can make mistakes, they can share their fears, their strengths, their weak, whatever it is, then they can flourish and they can develop a lot more positively, which I think is a wonderful message to share with your students. What about cultural context? Because this is something that a lot of teachers talk about. Students need cultural context and they need to understand not just the language but also the culture. So how do you implement that, and how do you kind of balance both Spanish and English cultures to enhance fluency, Natalia?
Yeah, so I understand their culture, right? Because it's my culture in a way. So then I'm like, guys, if you say this in this context in English, it's going to be a whole different thing. And they're like, oh, really? So I teach them about collocations, idiomatic phrases, but we also like research about different cultures, different accents. I don't know if you guys have heard of like the Valley Girl accent. It's a very big thing, and they don't know what it is, right? And so it's like this thing of like this actually exists, and
Yeah.
it's very subtle, very difficult for a person who's learning the language. But then they're like, oh yeah, it sounds different, right? And then we also learn about religions, like different types of religions, geography, how to pronounce states, like in the United States, right?
Mm-hmm.
That builds up also confidence when they're speaking with native speakers, because then they're like, oh, it's Ohio, right?
Yes.
And how do you say that, right? And so it's all these different cultural elements to it.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's great, because that's true, because that can definitely impact their confidence, because they feel like they can have a conversation that's not just about the language, but about the culture
Yes.
related to what they're learning.
It's
Yeah.
interesting what you said about the Valley Girl, because I have a client who's from Argentina and her boss is in San Francisco, and she was like, I think my boss hates me because he doesn't say yes. And I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, well, we might say in English yes, which becomes yeah, but apparently in California it's yeah, yeah, like this kind of sound. So it was kind of dismissive. So she lost her confidence. So it's really good that you made that connection and you explain those things, because students feel like, what's going on? This isn't what I imagined, right? There's a bit of a disconnect. So it's an
Yeah.
interesting experience.
Yeah, exactly. And I would like to add there even the small talk topic.
Yes, yes.
One of my students, he's like, he has a very good English, like B2 level, but
Mhm.
he feels so bad at work. And I'm like, why do you feel so bad? Like, your English is so good. And he's like, because they start their meetings talking about the weather and things that are
Right.
so trivial. And then they ask me, and then I answer these long answers, and they get really frustrated with me. And I'm like, oh, you're talking about small talk. And then
Yes, yes.
he like totally changed like his
Uh-huh.
approach to communicating with them, and now
Right.
he's super good because now he applies the small talk. And so
Yes. It's
Yeah.
definitely the case, especially when we're doing a lot of online meetings and using a lot of tech as well, right? So it can definitely change things.
Yeah, and that ties into what I wanted to ask about. Like nowadays, we have a lot of access to information, and we can actually expose our students to all these different cultural backgrounds and things that are affecting their English. But specifically technology, what do you think is the impact of technology on learning English today, especially for those that may not have access to our traditional classroom settings?
yeah, for sure. I think sometimes we think that technology can be the enemy for English teachers.
Mhm.
But I do think that it's a tool for us and a tool for them if it's used wisely, right?
Mhm.
Because it's also this part of the cultural, the natural way of communicating that technology cannot teach people how to communicate in that way. But when it comes to emails, when it comes to like communicating in a way that is more like corporate, then oh, that could really help somebody. I have students that keep always messaging me like, Natalia, is this email okay? And I'm like, well, just use Chat GPT. Like, to be honest,
Mhm.
I'm not gonna be like checking every single day your email. But they sometimes they say no, but it doesn't sound like I want it to sound. It sounds very artificial. And no matter how much, then it's like too informal. So there's not like a kind of lukewarm thing that they're looking, for. So it's this thing of that human part is so important because they
Mhm.
feedback. Then I also was recommending like this app. I don't know if you guys have heard of Elsa Speak. And
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah.
I started using it to check it out and see, but it didn't really give the right feedback. It was like
Mhm.
very inaccurate. So I told my students that sorry guys, if this was good, I would recommend it, but it's not
Mhm.
gonna help you. So it's this human feedback that they need, but we can also use technology for the written part
Mhm.
and for the more corporate kind of
Yeah.
job.
Yeah.
It's interesting you say that, Natty, because I've heard a lot of students say to me, "Oh, I just use this app and it's going to help me speak like a native, or it's going to help me speak
Mhm.
like I'm British or American." And I'm
The
like,
magic pill.
well, is that what it's about in terms of communication? It's, that I don't feel like that's what you need to be
Mhm.
successful, but it's more than just expression, right? So, I always talk about students, if you have an accent, that's okay. If you pronounce some
Mhm.
words a little different to me, that's fine. You have an identity as an English speaker, have an identity as a Spanish speaker, whatever it is. Like, you need to maintain and be proud of that voice and that identity because that's who you are. So, how do you help students find their voice in English while maintaining their identity? Because I think this is a really important, sometimes, overlooked aspect of learning a language.
Yeah, like I do give a lot of feedback on pronunciation. I really try to give them this thing of, okay, you got to sound as clear as possible, right?
Mhm.
But without feeling ashamed of their accent or their differences and the way that they say things. But they do appreciate this thing of like, oh, I didn't know, like instead of on the table, they would say on the table, right? And it's just
Mhm.
that little sound that makes a big difference. And then they start doing this thing of on, and then they feel like, wow, this is huge. So even though they still have the eyes that are a little bit more Latin sounding, most of it sounds pretty good in the sense of like more native. But I do say to them, guys, enjoy your cultural background. You should be proud of yourself. You shouldn't feel bad because
Mhm.
also there's this thing of like, I have to sound perfect, and then
Mhm.
the other people they have to adapt. Like you have to adapt to them. Like that's how they feel, right? Like I
Yeah.
have to adapt to them, and I'm like, no, we all have to adapt to each other,
Yeah.
right? People from the States or Canada, if they're learning Spanish, they have to adapt to that
Yeah.
culture. But
Exactly.
usually they feel like, oh no, if I just say one word, I'm like, wow, right? So it's the
Mhm.
thing that we say we need to be careful with how we perceive cultures and
Yes.
Mm.
keep that identity, the music, the sayings. For
Yeah.
example, one thing that I say is that if there's a dish, a meal, a staple dish that they say like, oh, how do I translate that to English? I'm like, don't translate it to English. That's
Right.
your
Mhm.
Right.
meal.
Right. Yes.
Say it in Spanish and explain what it is in English,
Exactly.
and that's it, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that's
awesome.
great.
I like that. I like
Yeah.
that idea. And one thing I'll always say to all my students is if you actually listen to native speakers and general everyday conversations, we make mistakes, we get things wrong, we use incorrect tenses or prepositions
Yep.
or skip things or miss things, so it's okay. Don't worry.
Yeah. Even when you teach them about all the different kinds of like the Valley Girl accent,
Yes,
like
exactly.
oftentimes it's like quote unquote wrong English,
Yeah.
Hmm.
right? But it's just that their identity. So I
Exactly.
love that. And I find that I've always found very challenging to convince my more advanced learners that the accent is not a problem. right? And you've touched on this already about the clarity, just making them more, like, clear. That's what we want to focus on. But in your experience, what do you do to kind of help that advanced level student polish their English a little bit? What do you focus on in that case, if not their accent, which we shouldn't?
Yeah, what I focus on is collocation. So I teach them collocations in different contexts. I also use improv in my classes.
Mm,
What we do is we do a lot of improv because I myself learned about it. And so I apply this to my classes. So everything is like we're doing two things at the same time. So for example, we're acting as if we're cooking together in a house. And at the same
mhm.
time, we are like improvising, like talking about life. So I say to them, guys, when you invite somebody over, you're not just like, here is the flour and I put it in the bowl and this and that, right? Like they are talking about, oh, so how is work? Oh, can you pass me the salt? Can you give me this? And so it's like
Mhm.
doing two things at the same time in a natural
Ah,
context. And then they're
mhm.
like, hey, how do you say this? And
Right.
oh, you say that, right? And so that's how we start. And then what I also do is that I accumulate in like vocabulary and I go over and over it instead of like keeping it aside and just forgetting about it. But like
Mhm.
Mm,
over time, we review things from, even October of last year,
Yep.
you know,
nice.
to
Mhm.
that point.
I love that. I love
Repetition,
that
yeah.
authentic immersion and like real life situations. This would actually happen because we do it all the time. We're having two or three simultaneous conversations. So it's really great that you
Hmm.
implement that into your teaching. Natty, what advice would you give to ESL teachers to keep their students motivated and engaged? Because we generally talk about this language plateau. Once you get kind of B2 level, maybe towards C1, it's a real drop off.
Hmm.
And we might see the improvements, but our students might not. And other teachers say, well, my students don't feel like they're learning, they're not improving. So what advice would you give, especially with Spanish to English?
Yeah, so what I recommend is stop focusing so much on like grammar, because grammar is just like a tool, but it's not the structure of our communication when it comes to advanced level. Like people can master grammar even when they're B1, but then their limitation is maybe in like expressions, in vocabulary, or even just the fluency. So what I recommend is this part of like doing these improv activities with them, like just work on communication in different settings and using like recycling the words that your students have studied in the past and like just use them in different contexts. Like, okay, we studied 20 words last week. Okay, let's use these 20 words, but in a different context.
Hmm.
Let's use these
Hmm.
20 words in a story now. Let's use
Yes.
Hmm.
100 words, but from October to January,
Yeah,
it's this thing. And then they start to use these words in a very natural way. And they're like, oh,
Exactly.
hmm,
now I just say these words
hmm,
without even thinking about them, right?
yeah,
So this is when they feel like they're growing, right? When
yeah.
they're absorbing vocabulary without memorizing, without exams, without quizzes. And it's just through this thing of immersion, like immersing themselves in these natural conversations, right?
Yeah. I love that because it's so easy for us to fall into that trap of feeling like we're only teaching them if we're giving them something new.
Yeah.
For teachers to be like, oh, these are today's words. And then the students feel like, oh, I'm learning, I'm learning, I'm learning. But are you? You're not retaining any of this. And the teacher also feels like, oh, I'm teaching them so much,
Yep. Yeah.
right? But then they're like, no, not really. It's not sticking. But just to wrap things up, I'd love to hear about a success story that you've had that particularly stands out to you, where you saw a student overcoming their struggles and now speaking English with confidence.
Well, that's hard because I could say that almost all my students
That's good.
have success story. Well, the ones that have been consistent, of course, right?
Mm,
But I would say that I have a story that was very funny and at the same time inspiring, which was of a student that he was really shy, and he just simply was very blocked with English. He had some kind of speaking inhibition in a way, even in his native language. But he could speak, but it was hard for him, even in his native language. And for him to achieve this fluency in English it has been a long journey for him. And one thing that was amazing was that one day he met this celebrity at I don't know, it was like a festival. And the celebrity only spoke English. So he wanted, like some kind of, I don't remember what it was, but like a signature, right? And so my student was like, how do I ask for this? And I'm not ready, but he tried, and in the end he got to talk to this celebrity, and they even took a photo together, and
Awesome.
he was like so happy. And he said, I would not have been able to do this because I was so shy, but you were able to take me to that level of asking, of interacting with this person that is very famous. I think he was like in a movie or something like that. I'm really not updated with who this person was, but my student was really excited about it. And so I'm happy that I'm able to, help.
Yes, exactly.
That's the whole point of this journey, right?
Exactly.
To impact and really deliver the results that the students are looking for.
That's wonderful. That's what we always say, even if you can play a part in a something like that, you might have helped just a tiny bit, but still the result, the confidence you give that student is huge, and you've helped them achieve new things and do things they never thought possible. So it's really inspiring. That's awesome. Thank you, Nati.
You got the autograph.
There we go. There we
Nice.
go. The proof's in the pudding. So, Natalia, where can our guests find out more about you? How can they connect and reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm in English with Crisol Instagram and Facebook.
Fantastic.
English with Crisol. And Crisol, what it basically means is a melting pot. That's the translation. And so what it is that it's a container where you put, refine the gold, because that's what I think that language learning is. You refine it through taking it to the fire, right? And
That's
then
awesome.
your English becomes gold.
There we go. Beautiful, beautiful.
I
That's
love
a
that.
really great note to end on. We will leave links to the socials in the episode description, so definitely check that out and connect with Natalia. I'm sure she'd love to share her experience and talk more about this. Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today,
Thank
Crisol.
you.
Thank you.
Alrighty, Natalia, thank you again for taking time to talk to us today about how you help your learners build their confidence and how they might struggle, especially with learning English as Spanish speakers. So that is it for another episode this week. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget, as always, to subscribe, follow us, and you can also send us an email, esltalkpodcast@gmail.com, or Instagram, esltalkpodcast as well. Don't forget as well, our website, you can get all of our episodes from the last 7+ seasons. Wow.
Gosh, I know, unbelievable.
esltalk.ca. That is the new the new website address, esltalk.ca. That is it for another week. We'll see you next week. Thanks, Faye.
See you then. Thank you.